Tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome everyone here, both in person and online. We do have an online audience today, so we'll get into it, but as we ask questions and so forth, we'll have to use microphones, so just be aware of that. Look, it's our pleasure, well, first off, I'm Neil Barclay, Chief Executive of Meridian, and it's our pleasure to host this morning the release of a concept consulting report looking into the feasibility of options to transition New Zealand's electricity sector to a largely renewable grid. Just a couple of housekeeping matters first off. Toilets are just this side of the lifts where you entered this floor today, and if we do have an emergency, it'll be relative, you know what to do, but please just follow your Meridian hosts, and I'm the tallest, so basically keep an eye on me and watch where I go, and you'll be fine. But if we do have to evacuate the building, we'll use this corridor on my left-hand side here. We'll move over to a stairwell on the western side of the building, exit at ground level. Our assembly point is across Lady Elizabeth Lane outside the Mojo Roastery. So probably the most important thing to remember is the lifts and the central stairwell that some of you may have walked up this morning are not available if we have to evacuate the building. Now, clearly, from my perspective, the electricity sector is probably the most key enabler to economic growth in New Zealand. We must use our renewable energy advantage to not only decarbonise our country through adapting other fossil fuel uses to electric, but also to build capacity to enable new energy-intensive and productive industries to add to New Zealand's productivity, our exports, ultimately our jobs. Now that can only be done really if we can maintain a really strong focus on the energy, the three limbs of the energy trilemma. And I guess we've seen over the last couple of 3 years how entwined those three limbs are, and if you get one wrong, it starts to impact the others. So it is vitally important that we have conversations like this morning in terms of how we actually progress that in a very ordered, seamless and productive way for our country. Now, most of you will be aware that Meridian and Contact have commissioned a study into hydrogen in Southland, large-scale hydrogen. We've also moved to an RFI process, and the interesting thing is we've found from the work we've done is we believe that hydrogen offers a remarkable and massively positive opportunity for our country, not only in terms of economic growth for the region, for the country, but also for managing emissions on a global scale. Now, the opportunity is there, but we do have to move relatively quickly. From the work we've done, we believe the economics are doable. You'll hear plenty of people telling you they're not, but we believe they are across a range of use cases from green ammonia, green iron, and urea. But the economics get really, really interesting and quite exciting when you look at the commercial value available to a hydrogen producer if they're able to provide seasonal demand response back to the market when our hydro lakes are low. And so that's sort of the guts of the conversation this morning. Now, Concept have done some work to prove that hypothesis along with others. And so that's the conversation we'll be having shortly. In a moment, I'll ask Simon Coates from Concept Consulting to come up and talk to a summary of their report. Then we'll move to a panel conversation with Simon, Neville Goliath and Keith Turner. That'll be moderated by Patrick Smelly. Patrick, I know you're up to it, but with this panel, you might have your work cut out for you. So anyway, we're dead keen to hear what you've got to say. And with that, I'll introduce Simon Coates to talk to the concept report. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Right, so I'm going to, mindful of time, I'm going to crack into it. So just a background to the report and the issue. Firstly, obviously, it's all around how do we decarbonise our economy in what is really a very rapid space of time. 2050 is not very far away. The challenge in the electricity sector is that the low carbon options are not as reliable in many senses. We have dry years, we have wet years, and wind and solar is variable. plus there's the higher capital cost. So to date, all the flexibility that we needed has been provided by low capital cost fossil solutions. And that's the key challenge that we're facing. How do we get the necessary flexibility? But there are opportunities. Firstly, renewables are becoming cheaper, wind and solar is becoming cheaper, and fossils becoming more expensive as we start to price in the cost of the greenhouse gas emissions. And there's another potential opportunity coming up in that TY Point is currently scheduled to close at the end of 24. That releases a lot of spare generation and transmission capacity, and one thing that Meridian and Contact have been looking at is taking advantage of that for building a hydrogen export facility. And what this study is all about is, as Neil said, if that can be operated flexibly, how might that help the New Zealand electricity system get the flexibility it requires to balance the variable renewables and to displace fossil generation? To look at the merits of this, it's necessary to compare it against alternatives. So as well as looking at the flexible hydrogen export opportunity, we also looked at, well, what is the potential if the TY smelter was to stay, operate that flexibly? And in Germany, they've started to invest in technology which allows a smelter to be operated flexibly. We had, and when you come to the results, you'll see we had 3 sub-scenarios. To provide that flexibility is all about reducing demand when the electricity system is short and bringing it up at times of renewable surplus. The key cost of that flexibility is what's the opportunity cost of not producing that hydrogen or not producing that aluminium. There's some uncertainty over that, so we looked at 3 sub-scenarios for that. We then compared other options. We're using thermal plant, either OCGT peakers with 2 options there, one continuing with fossil gas, or another option converting them to run on biofuels. And we also looked at the option of continuing with the Huntley Rankines with a bit of strategic coal reserve, which would be called in every time the lakes got very low. Another key option that people are looking at is a large South Island pumped hydro scheme that provides flexibility by pumping at times of surplus and then releasing and generating at times of scarcity. And lastly, we looked at the option of none of the above, but just generally overbuilding wind and solar. It should be pointed out that all of the above have some degree of renewable overbuild, and the flexibility there is by building so much that you're spilling at times of surplus, so you've got more than just enough at times of scarcity. To have an apples with apples comparisons of outcomes, we kept the demand in all the options the same, and that meant that effectively we were assuming that TY remains in these other options, but is inflexible. It continues as is. And lastly, all of the options source additional sources of flexibility to varying degrees from batteries and demand response. So Dave Weaver, here, a colleague here, he did most of the modelling, and effectively what the modelling we've done is to do a least cost optimization for a given scenario. What is the optimal mix of resources to meet New Zealand's electricity needs? There are some common assumptions for all the scenarios: demand growth, and we have rapidly growing demand from the electrification of the economy. But the modelling determines what's the least cost mix of building additional renewables, retiring thermal, calling on batteries or demand response at times of scarcity and building batteries. And that's just an example of the kind of some of the output. This is generation. As you can see, we've got a significant amount of generation growth, largely met by renewables, and the bits on the bottom just showing that some of that renewables will inevitably lead to increased spill. the results, I'm just going to talk briefly about this. The results show that it costs a lot of money to provide New Zealand with electricity services. I should say we only looked at 2 years, 2030 and 2050. It's very computationally intense. You can't run the modelling process. You can't run all the years. So we looked at 2 yees. 2030, that's the 100% renewables target year, and is probably the first year that it would be feasible to have a pump storage scheme developed. So that seemed a good initial year. And then 2050, that helps us explore the issues around significantly increased renewables, and it's also the target year for achieving net zero. So here are the kind of the results, and we were, as I said, trying to minimize costs for each option, and each option needed to be robust against the range of possible so-called environmental years. We used historical sequences for hydro inflows, for wind and solar, and so these costs show the average across all of these environmental years. For the purposes of this graph, we've grouped costs into categories. So there's the costs of building kit, and there's generation plant, which we split between renewables and thermal. And as you can see, in all scenarios, renewable, the cost of building and the non-fuel costs of operating renewables dominate. There's the cost of the 2 storage options, the pump storage option and batteries. There's the cost of fuel, fossil fuel in some instances, or biofuel in some instances. And then there's the cost of emissions, the CO2 emissions. We split that between the geothermal emissions and the fossil emissions. In all scenarios, we assumed that the carbon price to drive that cost will be the same as in the Climate Change Commission's demonstration path, and that was just under $140 a tonne by 2030 and rising to $250 a tonne by 2050. And lastly, at the top, we've got the costs of calling upon demand response. Now, that may be the opportunity costs of not producing hydrogen or aluminium, that's the H2 and Al things, and it's also the costs of calling on demand response from the rest of the economy at times of real scarcity. To really get an appreciation of the relative merits, we found it more useful to compare the differences relative to an option. And we chose the fossil gas peaker option as, if you like, the status quo continuing. It's also the option that was in the Climate Change Commission's demonstration path. And so what those bar charts show is the difference between the fossil gas peaker option and for all the different categories. So as you can see, the brown bits along the bottom show that all the other options have lower carbon emissions costs. The green bars for most of them above them show that actually all the other options require a bit more renewable build, with the one exception being the flexible hydrogen aluminium with quite low opportunity cost of curtailing flexible aluminium or hydrogen production. I'm not going to go through each of the different bands, but that gives you the context. And the red diamonds show the relative cost. And so in 2030, relative to the fossil gas peaker option, the only option which is cheaper is the option of a flexible hydrogen or aluminium plant with relatively low costs of operating the plant flexibly. The highest cost option is the pump storage, and that's because of the very high capital costs of the pump storage scheme. We've assumed that it will cost in this example, $4 billion to build, and an additional 200 million to fill it up, and amortized over, I think it was 60 years, the recovery, and you get a $335 million cost recovery requirement. So some quite significant differences between costs. In terms of emissions, though, actually relatively little difference in emissions. And this is, I think, is quite a key insight from all this work. Whilst the options have different, quite significant cost differences, actually the emissions outcomes are relatively similar. And for all the options, I've just split out the two fossil options, the fossil gas and the coal reserve options, and then grouped all the others. And as you can see, geothermal emissions dominate, and by 2030, our fossil emissions have really shrunk to very little indeed. And that's because if you start to impose a high carbon price on the sector, like $140, it becomes cost effective to build wind and solar to levels where you start systematically spilling to quite a significant extent. And it becomes cost effective, or at least our modeling suggests that it is cost effective to get to 99% renewables. And that 1% remaining fossil, in emissions terms, it's something, but compared to what we've had to date, it's really very small indeed. I should also say in this modeling run, we've assumed that all the cogen plant will have retired by 2030, consistent with 100% renewables, and also to achieve a like-for-like outcome between them. At the moment, for our roughly, I think it's 18% fossil generation that's quoted, 2% is cogen. So just a note there. In the context of the kind of the policy rationale, we think it's also important to consider about the whole of the economy. So on the right, I've shown our power generation emissions split between the fossil fuels, and then on the left, it's all the rest of our economy's energy emissions. And I've also put on there my perception, based on the work I've done for the likes of the Climate Change Commission and others, as to the opportunities to decarbonize through electrification. And there are some sectors, including the largest emitting sectors, where electrification is our key opportunity to decarbonize. Electric vehicles being the poster child for electrification, but also in the dairy processing and wood processing, electro boilers in many cases, and things like high temperature heat pumps are real opportunities to decarbonize. And for space and water heating, things like heat pumps or electric water cylinders. They're not miracle technologies, but real opportunities to cost effectively decarbonize. Now, in the earlier graphs, it showed there's big differences in costs of provision. Our modeling shows that will also flow through to big differences in consumer electricity prices. And I think that the challenge we have is that the big prize is over there on the left, electrifying these emissions. And we need to be careful that that goal isn't compromised by trying to squeeze out the remaining last fractional percents of emissions from the power generation sector. Great if we can, but if in doing so, we raise consumer electricity prices to the point where it becomes, we don't get as much electrification. That's a bit of an own goal in terms of decarbonisation. So, to summarise, our modelling shows that actually flexible hydrogen, if it can be operated flexibly, is a real opportunity. It's very large, and there's a large need flexibility. It's got that you're not investing lots of capital to provide that flexibility. The capital of the plant is paid for by selling hydrogen or selling aluminium. It's got good renewable balancing qualities. In terms of its downside, it would be nice if we could locate it in Marsden Point, say, because one of the other really interesting things coming out of this work is that as we move to ever higher proportions of wind and solar, the nature of our flexibility challenge starts to change. To date, it's all been about dry years has been the key constraint on the system. And our modelling shows that will still be an issue, but progressively less of an issue, and starting to become even more of an issue is balancing the very high levels of wind and solar and the so-called Dunkelflaute event. Periods of dark calm where you don't have the PV, you don't have the wind, and the need for capacity, and it's going to be in the North Island. North Island's where the growth in demand's going to be. North Island's where the existing fossils are going to be retired, and so the North Island's predominantly going to be where these new renewables are built, and we only have a limited link between the two islands. So actually, flexibility in the North Island is going to become progressively more and more valuable. In terms of pumped hydro scheme, it's excellent at renewable balancing. It's a very large and flexible resource, but it comes with a very hefty price tag. It'd be nice if we could move it to the North Island again. It also, it requires, although it's good at balancing, there's 25% losses in pumping it up the hill in order to generate it again, and that's material in the scheme of things. And also another interesting thing is its very size is going to be challenging for New Zealand. I think we've seen to date the issues around the uncertainty around will Tiwai stay or go. It's quite destabilizing to have big step changes, in Tiwai's case, big uncertain step changes, and we've had underbuild in renewables as a consequence because of this uncertainty about a potential big step change. And it's going to be very challenging to, in the years running up to the commissioning, for the system to transition from what will probably inevitably be a situation of relative scarcity to suddenly huge surplus as and when it's commissioned. Kind of at a high level, we suspect that's going to lead to, in the run-up years, higher prices and higher thermal generations. So the scheme may be filled with some thermal generation, effectively. In terms of the peaker options, there's a lot of advantages. The advantages of thermal generation is low capital costs, which is a real advantage if you want something that's only going to be turned on and off relatively infrequently. They're in the North Island, which is great because that's where all the need for flexibility is going to be. They're incremental in size, and we don't have these big step change challenges to cope with. And they're flexible. They're good at running up and down. Clearly, with the fossil gas peaker option, there are emissions, and that's not great. For the green peaker option, it's going to be a high fuel cost. And I think there's, one of the big uncertainties for us coming out of that is just how high is that cost, both in terms of the feedstock, but also in terms of the storing of sufficient biofuel. That's going to be a real challenge. Coal reserve, yep, it's in the right place, but it's got emissions, and its modelling suggests that it's not as good at renewable balancing as some of the peakers. And lastly, overbuild. It's just a very costly thing to do, to try and get to 100% by thrashing a system, by investing more and more and more in wind and solar, some of which is going to only be required, literally once every 10 years, effectively. So there we go. As I say, some real opportunities and flexibility. If you've got large sources of demand that can be operated flexibility, I think it is a real opportunity for New Zealand. But also, let's be mindful of the whole of economy picture when we're looking at options. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Simon. I'm going to ask Dave Weaver just to come up here in case there are any complicated questions about modelling. Can I turn to Neville Glias first for some thought starters? And what I'm hoping is that we'll be able to have a bit of a conversation in the room. There is a microphone here, but if you feel inclined to shout, you can. But people in Auckland or other places won't be able to hear you. Neville.
Right. Thanks, Simon. I think it's a very useful step forward. I'm not surprised by my first reaction is not surprised to the strong showing of flexible hydrogen. Certainly the modelling we're doing, flexible hydrogen, the thermal models, the electricity hydrothermal models, just lap up the flexibility that it offers. And it appears to be very useful to have that upregulation, the ability to go, to soak up cheap energy. Our focus has not been so much on system cost. Our focus has been on what the price distributions would look like. Will the market function in a 100% renewable world? And we've pretty much just focused in our early work on Lake Onslow versus pumped hydro. And our finding is in both cases, it looks like you've got a pretty workable price distribution. But certainly in the case of flexible hydrogen, you have a price distribution that looks a lot more familiar to us in this sort of 95% renewable world we're heading for on a status quo basis. Whereas Lake Onslow sort of has very long tails and, it will still send investment signals, but becomes a harder world to contract in. So, as I say, I'm not surprised that flexible hydrogen sort of shows up well here. In terms of surprises, I mean, it's very interesting in your pack to highlight that by 2030 your modelling is putting in 600 megawatts of batteries, presumably mainly in the North Island, in all the 100% renewable scenarios, whereas in the 99% scenario it's only 200. And I guess that just goes again to highlight how much more complex and difficult it is to run the system when you get to 100% for that last percent. Kind of three questions outstanding in my mind, and the first and most has to be the most important one is whether or not that flexibility can be secured and what sort of price is asked for. And I guess that's coming down to Meridian and Contact having good conversations with the hydrogen buyers and settling that out, and hopefully we'll get some clarity on that in the near term. The second question is something we tend to gloss over in our modelling, and I certainly did it in mine. It looks like you might have done yours. We wave our hands and assume that even if you have the HVDC upgraded to 2 750 megawatt poles, that you can get all that capacity north because there's some reserve source in the North Island to fully utilise it. Whereas in a 100% renewables world, you're not going to have that spare thermal capacity, and you're likely to want to use that grid during those peak demand times. So I think it'd be useful. I was kind of hoping maybe some Transpower feedback, what are the solutions for fixing that reserve problem? And then the last one is just a question to be useful. I don't know if you know around the scope of the battery project. It does seem to be that they're very much focused on physical storage options, and the cleverness of the flexible hydrogen solution is that it's all about flexibility. It's not about physical storage, and whether or not that means it's out of scope for their consideration.
Interesting point. Thank you, Neville. Keith.
3 minutes on this is not fair. Look, I think it's very laudable to try and analyse the national optimal system as we go forward to decarbonisation. There's no question decarbonisation is aided enormously by renewable electricity. And we are lucky we have two relatively cheap sources of renewable. I think it's really important you separate the volatility of wind and solar, which is on a day-to-week basis from the dry year risk. It's well known I support Onslow, and the reason I support Onslow is not because of the volatility, but because of the dry year risk. And I support it because I see the closure of Huntly and TCC as imminent. And if we just look at the early part of this year, those two plants were crucial in maintaining the customer's expected utility in the face of dry conditions. If those plants weren't here, we would not have got through early this year. I've been through a few dry years, right back as far as 1976, believe it or not, 1992, 2001, 2005. So our challenge for dry years is that they come quite suddenly and they are quite intense, not for a year, but for 6 months. And quite often they are followed by quite wet periods. And that means we need a lot of capacity to deal with the shortfall when it occurs. Look, I love the idea of interruptible hydrogen production, but I find the report is almost flippant because it concludes that hydrogen interruptibility is cheap. It is the lowest cost option. But it then goes on to say it doesn't know what the cost of interruptibility on hydrogen might be. And I think if you sit in the hydrogen buyer's shoes, a bit of interruptibility on a daily or weekly basis is not a problem. I sit in Australia, I see massive effort going into solar farms to produce hydrogen for the Japanese. Now that's got a daily volatility about it. I mean, it doesn't work at night. But it has a pretty reliable annual production, and that suits what the Japanese want to do with that hydrogen. I think the Japanese might see the price of our hydrogen quite differently if they have to shut it off for 6 months. And I think the hydrogen market is going to be immature for 30 years as it builds. That product's going to be scarce, everyone's trying to decarbonise, and I see our product as being low value in that context. There's another element around this report which does bother me. I spent 14 years optimising New Zealand's power system between 1981 and 1995. We developed the models from what used to be a 7% dry year energy margin right through to the stochastic dynamic multi-reservoir modelling that is still used today. But in optimising the system with those tools, we ran those tools for every year. We didn't take a spot year now and into the future. We actually developed the most efficient, the lowest cost plant mix over the whole of the study period. And it used to be 25 years. It was computationally demanding. We bought a DG4000 to do the computation work. So I don't think this analysis is complete or conclusive. And there's no question, if you put a large pump storage scheme into our system, it will radically change the way the system operates. What I could not reconcile is overbuilding wind leads to something like 5,000 gigawatt hours of wind spill. 5,000 gigawatt hours of wind in a year is 1,500 megawatts. 1,500 megawatts is 3 billion. I couldn't find where the 3 billion was being carried in the cost analysis. I obviously have to dig much deeper than I have been able to. So, look, I know that Onslow is a big project. The closure of Huntly is a big project. Closing Huntly is taking 750 megawatts out of the system. It's actually taking out the capability to generate 5,000 gigawatt hours. Putting Onslow in is not a big surplus. Onslow is a net consumer. It is not a net producer. It is nothing like the closure of Tiwai, which does place 5,000 gigawatt hours of surplus energy on the market. Onslow provides a strategic reserve for dry years, happens to be able to help the volatility of wind and solar. It's definitely not in the best place to do that, but it can do some. And we have been incredibly lucky in New Zealand to have so much hydro built with a 55%-ish capacity factor that means we have a lot of flexibility in our hydro to support the wind growth that has taken place. And there is no question that will be eaten up. So, to argue that Onslow is such a big project we shouldn't do it, to me is somewhat blind. There's no question in my mind Onslow is a nation-building project. It's a project that will last 100 years. It is no smaller than some of the other projects that supply this country. And I don't think we should shy from that. What we do have to keep an eye on is Huntly closing. And I don't know whether any of you had a look at the results of the failure at Callide in Queensland that blacked out Queensland for 18 hours. There were pictures of Callide with its main shaft sitting on the machine floor in shreds. That's what happens to old thermal plants if you run them too long. That could happen to Huntly tomorrow, and New Zealand would be in deep trouble. So look, laudable attempt, great to have the debate, but I certainly don't think the results are conclusive.
Thanks, Keith. It's definitely more than 3 minutes.
I had to give something for Simon to chew on.
Yes. Look, is there a reaction from the room or any questions from the room for a start? Tina, do you want to just take the mic? We can't pass it around because of the infernal bug.
Thank you for the presentation and the comments, actually. Just want to touch base on your comment, because I am a bit frustrated with the general attitude that we promoting industry to close. I think it's all about how do we make industry green and explore new export opportunities that are also green and supplied by green electricity. So we heard hydrogen as a potential opportunity to do so. Obviously, it's about a business model. So how do you make sure the customer overseas gets not frustrated because we're starting using hydrogen for our dry year, but it's probably contractual opportunities to have both. And the same with Tiwai leaving or staying. Maybe we can do both. I think there's lots of potential to use hydrogen and other green opportunities, and I think we're focusing much too many times on industry having to shut for us to decarbonize, and I just want to make this frustration public. Thank you.
Interesting point. I don't suppose, Simon, that you looked at the possibility of keeping both.
No, we didn't. That would be an embarrassment of riches, which we hadn't considered.
Okay. Look, I just wonder whether I might just put that question to you or to Dave that Keith has raised. He's saying basically your devastating analysis of the cost of Onslow misses some devastating analysis that he believes may be there with respect to the cost of lost wind and hydro.
No smoke and mirrors. We have kind of costed everything, and we're very happy to talk anyone who wants to through the detail. In terms of some of the other points, absolutely agree that it's necessary not to look at a year, but the whole suite of possible inflow years, and so we've used 30 years worth of both hydro and, importantly, concurrent wind and solar. And there are some very dry sequences in there, and it is challenging. But running a model with which goes through for a year, say 2030, it runs that year 30 times, going through the hydro sequences, and so you have starting storages and finishing storages. And dry year risk is and has been a big issue, and it will still be an issue, but thankfully, wind and solar is becoming cheaper and it is becoming cost effective to overbuild. And systemic spill is then reducing the scale of the residual dry year risk that we need to manage. So it's becoming a less important, still important, but less important than it was. And we have this additional challenge, this, and Tina will correct me on my pronunciation, Dunkelflaute challenge of the sun not shining at times and the wind not blowing at the same time. And this is shorter duration. Totally agree with you that I think one of the big unknowns is the ability for large-scale export, whether it be of hydrogen or aluminium, to curtail for months at a time. I think that's a big challenge. But I think it's a big challenge that the rest of the world is also going to be facing. The rest of the world is also trying to decarbonize and wean itself off using fossil energy to provide this flexibility. And so other aluminium producing, hydrogen producing, or steel or whatever, they're going to be facing the same challenges. And so I think we're going to see a growing need for trade in international commodities to accommodate this flexibility. Whether it'll be fast enough for 2030, I think that's a real question. And I agree that hydrogen is a very immature product. Storage may help, although it probably need to be ammonia or some other lower cost storage mechanisms. And that last point, I'm not saying because it's big we shouldn't do it. I'm saying because it's big we should be mindful of the consequences of it being big and try and manage as best we can the particular challenges with a step change in your system.
Thanks. I'm wondering if this...
Could Simon expand on the Dunkelflaute events? Yep. I mean, if we build around wind and solar for dry year risk cover, and then we get a Dunkelflaute event in a dry year, what does the system do? What happened? And particularly, I noted your comment that these could last for not just days but weeks.
Yep.
What does New Zealand do under those circumstances?
It's all about capacity, and this is why we're going to need to call upon batteries, and we're going to need to have an increasing amount of demand response in the North Island. Demand response generally. So we're moving from a market which has been energy constrained, is the key constraint on the market, to one where increasingly capacity, particularly in the North Island, is going to be the scarce resource. And that's going to need to be an increasing amount of short to medium term flex batteries. For the very short term, we're seeing some other kind of medium term storage options being developed around the world to challenge this, to address this challenge, and also demand response.
You see, I just can't believe that 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts of wind, all not running. Sure, it gives us a big capacity problem, but batteries are not going to solve that for weeks. Batteries will last a day or two. They're fantastic for peak demand management and volatility, but for weeks. And the other option is demand response. What that actually means is likely blackouts. Now, can we as an economy attract investment if we're going to be faced with blackouts? And I'd suggest that, we've had 2 or 3 blackouts in my career, well, very close to blackouts. I think if we start relying on wind under those sort of circumstances, we'll be seeing these sorts of events far more frequently. And I don't think that's an adequate utility for New Zealand. I think it'll very rapidly degrade us as an investment opportunity.
Andrew Casely, ECA.
Thanks, Patrick. Andrew Casely from ECA. Look, just an observation before a question, and I think I'm going to fire it at you, Keith. The observation that I have is that I think it's really critical when Simon puts up that decarbonisation journey that we're on, and the critical part that electrification will play in that, is that we actually look after our own national interests around that, really carefully. And I sit here, and Neil, I do have an unease that we are just going down the route again of exporting our high-quality renewables in form of hydropower. It just, and I know that you've got the demand management side of it, but I think Keith's question's a really good one, is what will that cost us? Is that, are we just going down the same route that we are in so much angst about with Tiwai at the moment? Is that it's such a superb resource that basically is just exported in aluminium ingot form, and it's just going to be hydrogen in future. For God's sake, let's decarbonise our industry and our transport fleet first with this superb renewable resource we've got. That would be my overriding plea. My question, Keith, when Simon puts that profile up there around the benefit and contribution that fossil peakers could provide, and boy, this could be career limiting, but I'm going to say it, I cannot help but think how sensible that is. And I think all of us know that in 2050, all the projections are we still have gross emissions. We have significant gross emissions still, either biogenic from our agricultural sector or residual emissions from both our large industrial processes or geothermal production or whatever it might be. We have gross emissions still. My question to you, Keith, why can't we accept that there may be some electricity generation residual emissions in our profile in 2050 that we just have to prioritise the offset of?
You've answered the question which I had here, which is it reasonable to believe that it's politically sustainable to have a pile of coal somewhere?
Well, how about better than blackouts, I would have thought?
Andrew, you're absolutely right. Look, the lowest cost capacity for the last 0.5% of the load duration curve is very low capital cost, very high operating cost. Now, if that's gas, if you can get gas to be as flexible as you need that to be, and actually, you know, I think somewhere in the report it shows that a little bit of gas peaking reduces dramatically the level of overbuild necessary to supply the energy. It's not there really for energy production, and it is certainly not suitable for dry year risk cover, but it is very efficient for peak demand services. I'm not wedded to 100% renewable. My passion for Onslow comes from the risk that the closure of Huntly and TCC represents to this country, and we won't see that till they close, and they may not close when we think they can.
So can I throw that to Neville? And just, I can see you champing at the bit to have...
I want to rescue Andrew's job.
Yeah.
Which is during the electrification of dairy factories, for example. If you keep the old boilers, when you to the extent you electrify some of them, if you keep the old boilers and then in these dry events, these Dunkelflouts, you then put biomass fuel through that and you take the electric load off the system. It's another in the vein of flexible hydrogen, flexible aluminium, and I think there's actually quite a lot of possibility in that. You can get a lot of megawatts out of that for those low probability, long duration events.
But if you were to take a pure analyst approach,
which I was,
yes. but at the macro level, if your choices for dry year security supply and your Dunkelflaute, I'm loving the fact that we've got this word on the agenda now.
Can we say it today?
That basically thermal wins, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. For those low probability events, it's more familiar to us. So from a pure market perspective, that's more familiar as well. But the trend of the last few years is to go to 100% renewable, and I suspect we're on a transition. This country is on a transition. All countries are on the transition to 100% renewables, and I think 100% will be where we go. It's just where we get there. And I think this sort of is a transition from the discussion we've just had towards where Simon was talking about, where all the economies in the world start to appreciate that there's going to be variability in individual countries' supplies of these products that are energy intensive, and the flexibility of those of switching your supply from one country to another, spot cargoes, becomes very important. That's where the release valve for your 100% renewable energy systems comes in.
I'm not sure who this is a question for. I'll come to you in a moment. It might be for Guy or maybe for Neil. But I can't help but feel that, I think Keith's point is well made, that if you have to have a flexible contract, then you're going to have to pay a price for the flexibility. So whoever puts the money in is going to expect to be well paid for the flexibility. So we've got 25% uphill pumping. If you've got Onslow as well, you've got the most expensive way of making hydrogen. It's relatively energy efficient, and we're going to be competing with Australia, which just does it by So why does it make sense?
All right. Actually, that's a good question. And Tina was on the money, which is the answer's in the business model. But what does that mean? So we're talking at the moment to shortlisted suppliers and purchasers and project developers of hydrogen, but also the end customers where possible. And it's fair to say the nature of these businesses are they're big petrochemical resource management companies, and they're used to making widgets with an infinite input source of energy. So that's their kind of DNA. But as you start to explain to them what we're trying to achieve with our electricity system, and then you overlay their understanding of our political system, which is you're exporting something for a small number, and meanwhile electricity prices in New Zealand are $300 or $400. They understand the licence to operate risk that brings to their kind of project. So they get your context. You just got to take them through the journey. And then when you start to put some numbers around the value of this flexibility, they can start to see how this can work from a commercial perspective. And then the other overlay is
so
that...
you're saying that they are seeing that, hey?
Yeah, I mean, hydrogen plant
just say, okay, Abu Dhabi it is.
No, hydrogen plant's super flexible, so it's not a technical challenge. So we've got to the bottom of, can it be done technically? Yep, that's all about the business model. And so they're now moving to how do we solve this? And they're thinking of things like from a portfolio perspective, if they've got more than one plant and a customer base, it's a bit like a transmission grid. They've got more than one source of production and they've got diversity between those. Do they kind of contract just below your maximum output and then kind of run the rest through spot? These kind of commercial mechanisms which give them some resilience from this kind of a bilateral deal with a big chunk in it every now and again. So they're already turning their minds to that. And we're already saying, this is valuable, we expect to pay for it, we don't expect it to be for free. So if we don't achieve it, we haven't achieved anything. So that's the plan. If we deliver this thing, is it for it to deliver flexibility?
Is there a hydrogen futures market at this stage?
No. This is all future. A bit like LNG was 20 years ago.
Wouldn't the hydrogen buyer immediately say, "I'll pay you 334 million"? I'll reduce your price by 334 million to avoid Onslow, and that will immediately set the discount that we would have to apply. They will want to extract all of the value of flexibility in our market to themselves.
They're not really looking at it like that, Keith. They're going, well, what's my kind of substitute or my alternative supply source? They're also thinking about...
They'll get smart.
It's an arbitrage thing at the end of the day. And some of them are even thinking a bit like Nev's point around how can you retain some form of local production? And that might even be thermal-based hydrogen to kind of backfill, so you end up exporting your problem to the kind of customer end. So they use green, when it's available, and then they substitute that with, grey or blue if there's a gap. So they're thinking about all these different ways of how do you solve the problem. So
we've got quite a market evolution to go through to get them through to a mature contracting environment.
Yep, we do.
Because there is no market in hydrogen at this point.
No, but we've got a global imperative to get there much faster than we think.
But I'm assuming there is a big market in ammonia globally.
Massive market.
Yes.
Yeah. So these products are highly substitutable. So it's anyway, that's the kind of scuttle. That's what we're hearing from people who are looking at doing this thing. The other thing is they look at the New Zealand opportunity and they're comparing it to others, and at a 95% capacity factor average, it hits out of the park. These big solar-based hydrogen facilities or even wind-based facilities. It really is. They see it as world class. So, anyway.
Thanks, Guy. I've got a quick comment from Neil here. No, I'll come to you next.
I just want to speak to Andrew's comment about creating another Tiwai or 2.0 or whatever. That's absolutely not what we're trying to achieve here. We are trying to come up with a New Zealand Inc. solution, and we are involving iwi, we will involve the government, we will have an open conversation. We're not proposing to turn up with a commercial model and go, da-da, there it is. I think it's far too important for the country's future to take that sort of approach. So that's not how we're thinking about it. But to Tina's point too, I also believe that hollowing out New Zealand industry to achieve a carbon outcome will ultimately not work if we've got a low carbon economy but no jobs. So we do need to facilitate, growth in industry and productive industry at that.
Thanks. I had a question right here.
So you guys have been at sort of this level. I'm going to take you right back. So one was more, Neil really just covered it there, the point, which I agree with Tina, which is maybe Keith, getting your observations on the whole idea of decarbonising New Zealand versus the globe. In my view on it is, the atmosphere doesn't know any difference between country boundaries. So I see that as a problem. New Zealand has got some backed themselves into a corner. So I'd be interested in your observations on the decarbonising the globe versus New Zealand conundrum. And maybe, Simon, the main question was, and Tina, can you say this word correctly for us? Simon might have got it. Not bad. All right, there you go. Simon's pretty good. I'm not going to attempt to say it. But so the more question for Simon, before that gets locked in as a fact in everyone's heads, were you talking about, yes, these things happen in Germany, absolutely. Our experience of sort of the 20 years worth of solar and wind data that we see in New Zealand is those events do not happen in New Zealand, like for weeks on end. You see 1 or 2 days, but so before people get in their heads that you get periods where weeks where there's no sun or no solar, we see in New Zealand data there's no evidence of that at all. So it's a good question of opposite. I mean, you get periods of low wind and solar, absolutely. So just more observation for you. What are your thoughts on that? So that's one, and Keith, the global versus New Zealand decarbonisation was.
Yeah, I haven't got a duration curve of the duration of the scarcity, but it's short duration periods of no sun and wind are a challenge, whether it's days or weeks or months. I don't think it's months.
Hi. So we use the term Dunkelflaute. We're not aware of how it works in Germany, but we do see days to weeks of shortage here. Perhaps the German experience is months. You're right, we don't see months. But it is still a problem on that time frame, which is, maybe we need to find a different word.
Kleiner Dunkelflaute.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. I'll let you answer the question for Keith.
Look, global versus New Zealand. I'm in New Zealand. I'm a passionate New Zealander, Grant. You know that. And the thing that I've always felt right from the early days of this, getting into this sector, we have an extraordinary competitive advantage in New Zealand. There was, when I was growing up, electricity prices in New Zealand were the third cheapest in the Western world. And we have that low cost as well as low carbon. So we've got a massive advantage here, and how the hell do we take advantage of it? I mean, my view is actually our consumer prices should be considerably lower than they are. And that will go to Tina's point about, that will motivate investment in a lot of electricity business, especially if we're early in the decarbonisation phase for production. So I just want to see the country take advantage of the advantages that it's got. Sort of a bit alongside Andrew's point, really. I mean, do we want to export our advantage? Well, that actually has a big economic plus for us. I mean, there's 1,000 people in Invercargill who think it's a pretty good thing. Is that the right answer for New Zealand? Well, you have to judge these things at the time. But I'm not about decarbonising the globe at the expense of New Zealand.
Okay, we're getting underway and it's 9 o'clock. So, Tina, do you have one quick comment and then we'll come here?
You spot on. It's not like New Zealand. It's actually not New Zealand or the globe. It's us. And obviously, with industry leaving, you might just export a problem to another place where emissions might even be higher, might not, but could be. So I don't want to go into the carbon leakage conversation because we had that a couple of times as well. But obviously, right, with the right prices, there's obviously much more opportunity to do whatever you want because the service economy is actually also quite energy intensive. We have to keep that in mind. And so there are definitely the export opportunities to help other countries as well to decarbonize. And I must say, we must have the head a little bit under the sand if we don't see how much is going on around the world in hydrogen. It's extreme, and the Germans do the same mistake to what they did with solar. They're pumping lots of money into hydrogen, which means that will stimulate a lot of things, which means it will come to us at the end anyway, so we can either get prepared or we might actually miss out. And with the other thing I wanted to say was an event we ran just a couple of days ago on energy security. We had a Swedish person speaking, and he was saying that actually New Zealand is a really awesome position because we have already a lot of hydro, and now when solar and wind is already incredibly cheap, we just add that and we get a lot of flexibility for that one as well. So that's the diversity of supply conversation, which already makes probably a lot as well. That's just me. Thank you.
Hi, John Clark, Transpower. Transmission does need to be part of the mix. To Neil's conversation, not sure about what assumptions you've got there. A lot of this conversation is about uncertainty. And I guess we're not waiting to work out exactly what's happening or to see how generation demand and options mix. We've already got our net zero grid pathways work underway. That's in 2 stages. What can we do on a least regrets basis out to the mid-2030s? What do we need to get out to 2050? So please get involved in that. I can't really ask the question. I'm putting in a blatant plug instead. And in terms of the HVDC, cables come near due replacement in the very early 2030s. There's an opportunity to do that work earlier. We've already got some costings. In the interim, the sort of things which would get it up to high capability, maybe some of the proposals get to a point, then people say John Clark's just a grid builder, we might need a second DC link, but there's certainly a lot you can do with the current one. And we applaud measures by the likes of Meridian to put batteries in the North Island that, at least in the shorter term, help enable more DC transfer north.
Great, thanks, John. Really, the quick question there was, are there better alternatives than sort of 750 megawatts worth of, very short duration batteries just sit there charged to offer reserve? Or is that the best?
I guess the way things work at the moment, it's sort of a market thing to provide the reserve, and clearly as big thermals that can provide fast reserve disappear and perhaps some of the industrials don't provide it as well, it's looking for a market response. So as you say, a battery, technologically wise, you could do some things to the HVDC link itself internally, but it's akin to putting a battery in it anyway, right, to address the reserve issue. Right. So for now, it's really good the market's providing that response. If it's a conversation we'd need to have before we did cable upgrades and changes to the converters to get more capacity out of them, whether there was a role for Transpower to become an investor to reduce the amount of reserve. That would be a more interesting conversation.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. I mean, one of the great things about being a journalist is I don't have to decide about any of these things. I can just write about all these various points of view, which is a vastly preferable position to being. It's the alternative of actually being in the industry and trying to work it out, having been in both positions. I think it's fair to say this is just one part of the puzzle. It's an interesting part, and it's a challenging way to think about these issues. So thank you, Simon. Thank you, Keith, for your sterling defence of Onslow. Thank you, Neville, for your calm analysis in the middle. And I'm sure this debate will go on, and we'll see where it gets us to. Thank you.